making transparent the creative process by which one would hope that we could soon.
Hey, Joe, start over.
Okay. That's good, because I didn't like my beginning here. Hello, everyone. Greetings from Houston, Texas, and LaRouche Pack. Today is Saturday, June 15th, here in Houston. And we're gathered here 1 week after an extraordinary event that happened in cities all around the United States last week, but principally in New York City, which was the commemoration memorial event honoring the historic legacy and ongoing creative contributions of statesman, economist, philosopher, genius, who inspired us all for some 50 years, Lyndon LaRouche. So gathered in New York, down there around downtown Manhattan, we had United Nations diplomats, we had musicians, cultural, religious leaders, co-combatants from all around the country, retired intelligence professionals, and also 3 participants of note, which contributed greatly to the thought content of the day, were Johann Sebastian Bach, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and Ludwig van Beethoven. Not just for entertainment, but with the idea that the future determines the present, and the creative contributions are inspired by the future possibilities of mankind. Lyndon LaRouche is acknowledged, among all his other contributions, to have advanced the pedagogy and making transparent the creative process by which one would hope we could soon generate and see a new blossoming and resurgence of classical music culture in the United States. The chief speaker was Lyndon LaRouche's widow, Helga Sepp LaRouche, who rallied us to carry Mr. LaRouche's mission forward. So where do we stand in that mission today? And I'm going to come back to that a little bit later in my presentation. Now, at the core of the discussions, however, of this memorial event was a challenge that stands before us right now, and that is the exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche. And I'll point to the image up on the screen there. What was featured was some excerpts from hearings that occurred in 1998, which we called then the Man-Chestnut Commissions, after the primary officiators of this event. This happened then in 1998, 4 years after Mr. LaRouche was released after 5 years of a grueling 15-year sentence in federal prison. So in addition to Mr. and Mrs. LaRouche, two of the principal speakers were LaRouche's attorney throughout the whole trial process, Odin Anderson, and also Ramsey Clark. And you may recall that Ramsey Clark was Attorney General of the United States during the administration of President Lyndon B. Johnson. And Ramsey Clark prepared an appeal of great merit that was never heard. This appeal went all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States and was never heard. And Clark had signed on to the LaRouche case after LaRouche was already in prison with a 15-year sentence, which effectively was a death sentence for a 67-year-old man. That's how old LaRouche was at the time. But had this appeal been heard, the full array of corruption, of venal maliciousness, of collusion between the intelligence agencies, the media, and the Department of Justice would have been put on full display. So we've heard a lot about that word collusion lately, haven't we? Well, this took the cake, the LaRouche case, in terms of collusion. And it was collusion with a foreign hostile power. And that power was and is the British Empire. But Clark stuck with the case even beyond the formal appeal and oversaw and moved on the process of at least getting LaRouche released on parole. And what I have before you on the screen here is is from a letter he addressed to Janet Reno, the Attorney General of the United States, who held his job during his former job during the Bill Clinton presidency. And what he said, as I'm quoting here, he says, "I have been an attorney in this case since shortly after the defendants were sentenced in January 1990 and appeared as co-counsel on appeal and on the subsequent motions and appeals in the proceedings under 28 U.S.C. 2255 and so forth. I bring this matter to you directly because I believe it involves a broader range of deliberate and systemic misconduct and abuse of power over a longer period of time in an effort to destroy a political movement and a leader than any other federal prosecution in my time or to my knowledge." So that's from Ramsey Clark, and obviously he saw a lot of corruption as Attorney General, but our case took the cake. Now, I want to let you know that first of all, that the memorial event we had for LaRouche is now available in a slightly edited form on video, and you can get that on both the LaRouchePAC.com website, but also Schiller Institute, and everyone should watch it and watch it again to get a sense of the rich contribution of this man. There's still a lot of confusion out there as to who is Lyndon LaRouche, what's it been about over these years. This video will give you a very rich sense of who this man was and how much he was loved and honored and respected all around the world. But I'm very happy to tell you that within a week, LaRouche PAC will be releasing a video on our website, and I'm putting everyone on notice out there in internet land that you have to be ready when this video is released. It'll be about 80 minutes long, going through the essence of the LaRouche case and making the case for exoneration. This will include very prominently footage from the 1986 FBI raid on our National Publishing Headquarters, ordered by the same Robert Mueller, who we've been watching in his vendetta against President Trump for the last 2.5 years. Back in the 1980s, the same Robert Mueller was deployed against Lyndon LaRouche. And we have to make the case for his exoneration. So I'm showing you here a montage of some of the stuff that came out through in the course of the case in terms of and this goes back to the 1960s and 70s when our movement was, in its very inception. LaRouche intervening in the youth turmoil of the 1960s to recruit something positive and good that could step forward to lead the nation, and the evidence we gathered of FBI and COINTEL probes against us even back then. But you'll see in the middle, as that case came to its the first leg of that case came to its culmination in Boston, Massachusetts. The jury, at the end of it all, convened a press conference and said they would have voted LaRouche not guilty. Much ado about nothing. The government did not let that thing stand. They launched a second prosecution in Alexandria, Virginia, that put LaRouche away in the twinkle of an eye. But that's what the video's about. That's not exactly what I'm going to talk about today. But what I do want to say is that on this question of exoneration, the man that must do this is President Trump. Okay, and I'm addressing to you, President Trump, directly. You can take the step, and you must take the step, to finally bring justice to this case. not just to clear the name of a great man, but to save your own administration and to save the nation. And that's the demand that we're making to you, Mr. Trump. So here are the two individuals, as I said, that launched the prosecution against LaRouche. One of them on the left is William Weld, then Attorney General of Massachusetts, and his chief underling back then, an assistant, Robert Mueller. And the name of our forthcoming video is, I believe, the LaRouche case, Robert Mueller's first hit job. So what goes around comes around. So once again, this appeal that I'm making today and the appeal of this, this pamphlet, which is now in broad circulation for the exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche, this is made to you, President Trump. Now, we need to ask, why? What do we expect to accomplish by exonerating a man who is now passed on into eternity? I want to remind everyone that Mr. LaRouche passed away. He died on February the 12th of this year, on Abraham Lincoln's birthday. Well, look at what's going on in the world today. In just a few weeks, we're going to have a meeting of the what's called the Group of 20 Nations meeting in Osaka, Japan. And finally, we'll have an opportunity for the four great leaders of the world finally to come together. This is what LaRouche has said is necessary for these four nations, these four heads of state. Xi Jinping of China, Vladimir Putin of Russia, Narendra Modi, who just won a significant re-election in India, and President Trump, whom you think would be somewhat liberated from the attacks by now, since the collusion narrative has been disproven, to get together and begin to work something out, because we are facing an onrushing crash of the dollar-denominated financial system. You could see this with the rush to lower interest rates again by the Federal Reserve, that they're trying to somehow flood the markets with cash to keep the bubble afloat a little bit longer. Now, going into this summit, you had really interesting stuff unfolding, where this last week President Abe of Japan went to Iran to, here Abe is hosting the summit. He was going to meet with Iran, which is one of the big flashpoints of confrontation. Maybe something good could come out of this. Maybe Iran could come to the G20 summit. Maybe the oil embargoes could be lifted. You also had other indicators of a shift of paradigm back towards sanity again this week. We found out about a trade union demonstration in Los Angeles against the Green New Deal insanity. Maybe that's a harbinger of a return to science and progress, guiding our trade union movement. Not that somewhat south of there in Tijuana, Mexico, you actually had a demonstration in Mexico of indicating the willingness for friendship with the United States at the point that the tariffs that President Trump had demanded of Mexico on the immigration question were at least temporarily rescinded, and there was informal discussion of joint cooperation for regional development. Just what the doctor ordered, just what LaRouche has been saying over the years. You're worried about immigration, you've got to stop poverty everywhere. China's willing to work with us on that. But then what happened in the same week? Almost on the heels of this Abe meeting, in fact, while it was going on, we had a very suspicious attack on two oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman, including a Chinese vessel called the Kokuka, the Japanese vessel called the Kokuka Courageous. Within hours, the Secretary of State, former CIA Director Mike Pompeo, said, Iran did it, right, and issued a government assessment to that effect without a shred of evidence to support it. But then President Trump showed up on Fox and Friends, basically endorsing what Mr. Pompeo had said, And so he's effectively scuttled in the course of 24 hours these delicate negotiations with Iran that Japan had initiated. So what are we to think? You know, what interest could possibly benefit from, how could Iran possibly benefit from bombing or attacking or torpedoing a Japanese vessel, you know, while the prime minister is there trying to conduct negotiations? You know, when we hear this, we just roll our eyes and say, oh, another false flag incident. Do we have to fall for it every time? And as people know, that while China is the most important ally the U.S. could possibly have in terms of rectifying things in the world economy, you know, the U.S. is in trade war with China right now. You know, Huawei is being sanctioned, and I read on Sputnik this morning that President Trump says he doesn't even care if he meets with Xi Jinping or not at the summit in Iran. So, I mean in Japan. So, how are we going to break this fix? You know, how are we going to make truth prevail? How are we going to break the manipulation that's, you know, arrogantly coming forward from the CIA, and particularly British intelligence in all of this, because they are the ones that are the experts going back hundreds of years in destabilizing things in the Middle East and everywhere else. And the average citizen looks at this stuff, and we know because we talk to them every day. That's what the LaRouche movement does. We're out there in the field, we're talking to people on the phones, and they say, well, where's the truth in all this? Who's really running the show? There's no way to change things. You just have to survive. But you know what? There really is truth. And the character of human history is that civilization has advanced over the millennia by the actions of courageous individuals who stood firm, even to the point of death sometimes, to be the beacon of truth when other forces and societies had compromised to the pervading paradigm of corruption and evil. And one such individual who speaks to us from the ancient, beautiful culture of Greece was the philosopher Socrates. And this image here is taken from as Raphael imagined it in his School of Athens. This is part of a much larger fresco. That's Socrates on the far right, who told us all he wasn't a very handsome, you know, physically handsome individual. But there he is in dialogue with Archimedes, Alcibiades and others. And his words still shine in the darkness, brought to us through the records of his student Plato, who transcribed or rethought and put down Socrates' words as he remembered him after Socrates had died. And I'm going to invite my friend Victor to come up here to present a small excerpt from Plato's dialogue, The Republic, in which Socrates and his younger friends are mulling over the nature of truth and justice, and imagining how they might create a beautiful society governed by higher principles. So here in this dialogue called The Republic, we hear young Glaucon posing a paradox to the elder Socrates. In this mortal life, who is the happier man? The unjust man who always gets his way based on lies, manipulation, and deceit, or the just man who stands for principle without the acclaim of society? So here's Glaucon playing the devil's advocate, posing this question to Socrates. Victor?
If we are to form a real judgment of the life of the just and the unjust, we must isolate them. There's no other way. How is the isolation to be effected? Allow me to answer. Let the unjust man be entirely unjust, and the just man entirely just. Nothing is to be taken away from either of them. and both of them are to be perfectly furnished for the work of their respective lives. Let the unjust make his unjust attempts in the right way. And lie hidden if he means to be great in his injustice, for he who is found out is nobody. The highest reach of the injustice, of the unjust, is to be deemed just when you are not. Therefore, I say that in the perfectly unjust man we must assume the most perfect injustice. There is to be no deduction, but we must allow him, while doing the most unjust acts, to have acquired the greatest reputation for justice. If he have taken a false step, he must be able to recover himself. He must be one who can speak with effect if any of his deeds come to light, and who can force his way where courage and strength as a force is required, and where command of money and friends is required. And at his side, let us place the just man, in his nobleness and simplicity, wishing, as Aeschylus says, to be and not to seem good. There must be no seeming. For if he seem to be just, he will be honored and rewarded. And then we shall not know whether he is just for the sake of justice or for the sake of honors and rewards. Therefore, let him be clothed in justice only, and have no other adornments. And he must be imagined in a state of life the opposite of the former. Let him be the best of men, and let him be thought the worst. Then he will have been put to the proof, and we shall see whether he will be affected by the fear of infamy and its consequences. And let him continue thus to honor death, being just and seeming to be unjust. When both have reached the uttermost extreme, the one of justice and the other of injustice, let judgment be given as by which of them is the happier of the two.
Thank you, Victor. And think about that, because this is not an academic question at all. Plato is speaking to us from 2,500 years in the past. At the time that Plato set this dialogue, taken from memory to the written word, the beautiful society of Athens had been corrupted almost to the point of destruction through the sophistical manipulations run by the oligarchical priesthood, the magi tied to Persian, and the oracles at Delphi. It was being torn apart by no-win conflict we know as the Peloponnesian Wars. Greek society briefly came back during the short period of Alexander the Great, but with Alexander's early death, Greek civilization fell apart and was eventually absorbed into the monstrosity we call the Roman Empire. And Socrates, he was put on trial on a charge of corrupting the youth, thrown in prison, and soon put to death. And I bring to you here, this is a painting somewhat, well, it's a painting by Jacques-Louis David of France, who is called today a neoclassicist, but imagining what was going on in Socrates' prison cell, where Socrates had been offered a plea bargain, he rejected it. He was offered a chance to escape prison, he rejected that. He took the hemlock, which killed him, And in this image here, that image on the bottom end of the bed is Plato, even though Plato wasn't there, and at the time Plato was a young man. But in Jacques-Louis David's image, it's Plato's, imagining the event, and also with Plato in front of that that big arch there. He's the one figure sitting in darkness. He's kind of projecting into the distance and into the future. So anyway, this is a question we have to ask almost every day, and I will tell you, Victor and I were out last week at a campaigning around LaRouche's ideas down in Richmond, Texas, the county seat of the county just south here of Houston, and we had a conversation with a man, I would say mid-40s, father, Marine veteran, a veteran of Desert Storm, the first Iraq war, and what did he say? We didn't get anywhere with him, because he says there are no principles, there is no truth, there's nothing worth fighting for. Now here is a man who had obviously put his life on the line, and I would suspect that when he signed up for the military, it wasn't just for a paycheck. He probably did sign up with some patriotic fervor. But frankly, he had been morally burned out, and we should never be content with that as a permanent condition. That's our mission as organizers, to spark that creative possibility in people's minds. But this is our challenge. I mean, Helga LaRouche has told us time and again that in order to really win this fight, yes, exoneration is the immediate task before us, but she says we need a new paradigm. And in a way, that seems utterly impossible. I mean, how are we going to do this? And of course, what do we mean by a new paradigm? Well, we often talk about, and people, and I'm 63, and people that do remember life before and after the John F. Kennedy assassination, we often talk about the shift in paradigm that just came in like a onslaught after his murder and the cover-up of that, right? The substitution of the scientific and cultural optimism represented by NASA with a culture of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I would think that this fellow we talked to wasn't really part of that. But that cultural shift after Kennedy was shot was real ugly. On the heels of the counterculture came in the green movement, a hatred of science and progress, a hatred of people, the idea that people can accept the idea of suppressing or even radically reducing the world's population in the name of defending Mother Earth. This is very un-American. Americans did not think that way. And yet, LaRouche knows that the corruption began much earlier, right? In fact, he saw it pungently when he was over there in India, in Burma, as a young medic in the military during World War II. The excitement and the hope that America could lead the world, to provide real development, but then the death of Franklin Roosevelt. The Truman administration being captured almost immediately by Winston Churchill, and the British plan for restoring the empire after the war, and the absolutely unnecessary dropping of bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Not to win the war against Japan, because that had already effectively been accomplished through Douglas MacArthur and his long-term policy for the Pacific, but to assert America in league with the British as the leaders of the unipolar world at that time. And one guy that was totally tickled pink by all of these developments was Lord Bertrand Russell, whom LaRouche deemed probably the most evil man of the 20th century. And I'm going to quote you here from something called Science and War, 1951. This is Bertrand Russell. "We must learn not to say never, better death than dishonor. We must learn to submit to law, even when imposed by aliens whom we hate and despise, and whom we believe to be blind to all considerations of righteousness, i.e., with the advent of the ultimate weapon, the nuclear weapon, then principles, goodness toward your fellow man, be damned. So after the war, the wonderful hope for world development, independent of all empire, was crushed and replaced by a Manichaean Cold War between communism and the Western powers controlled by London and Wall Street and their military arm, NATO. So LaRouche, who was, as a military medic, witnessed this shift even before being shipped back home from his military stint in the Burma, India, China theater. He witnessed this shift, and when he returned home, the U.S. was being culturally suffocated under a reign of terror called McCarthyism, whose chief axiom is there is no truth, there are no higher principles, just look out for yourself. And this assumption was built into the 1960 counterculture, the children of the World War II generation that allowed itself to be corrupted by this outlook. But with the Theodor Adorno of the Frankfurt School and Hannah Arendt, who is still idolized by old lefties, the argument was anyone that believes in truth, of asserting of knowable truth, that's proto-fascism. The best is to have no truth at all, just a smorgasbord of approved opinions. So with the JFK assassination, LaRouche began to pull together an independent movement, which even then enraged the oligarchy by corrupting the youth, away from the degenerate axioms of the synthetic counterculture. So that's a little history of our movement. Now, go back to the Chronicle. Go back to the Plato, when he talks about the unjust man who seems to be the most just. Well, I thought about this when I picked up the Chronicle a few days ago, which I'm going to show you here, right? You see the postage stamp that was just dedicated to a man who was almost made a saint here in Houston, George Bush, right? Right, George Bush, right? When he died 6 months or so ago, the flags were lowered for 30 days, right? We heard these recollections about Bush and the kinder and gentler America. He loved children and puppies and Barbara and socks. And well, do people remember the Panama invasion on Christmas, right? To cover up the drug running that Oliver North and company were doing. Do people remember the first Iraq war? Do people remember that Bush squandered, and not just squandered, but obliterated the positive moment in history that was given to us by the work of Lyndon LaRouche with Ronald Reagan earlier on the Strategic Defense Initiative, the moment that was created with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the artificial division of the world, the division that had been created by Winston Churchill and Truman finally ended, and now we could restart this process of world development, of fighting poverty, ending war, moving forward. No, with George Bush at the helm and Margaret Thatcher, riding him like a little pony, we entered this era of endless war and Anglo-American world domination that Bush liked to call the New World Order. But before all that, the first thing he did was to put Lyndon LaRouche in federal prison. Lyndon LaRouche was locked up on false charges on January 27, 1989, 1 week into the George Bush presidency. And for all of that, at the end of it all, George Bush was knighted by the Queen, Sir George Bush. So the constitutional prescription against foreign titles and so forth, I guess that only applies to sitting government officials and not retired. but Bush called that the proudest day of his life when he received that knighthood by the Queen. So this is a sad fact that for most of human history, the world has been dominated by empire, the imposition of arbitrary will of a moneyed oligarchy over the interests of the masses of population, herded like so many cattle, controlled by a bestial culture. Now, we all know about the Roman Empire, the degenerate circuses, the perversions of the emperors and so forth, a horrible image of man. But then there was one individual who defined a different concept of man who rejected all of this, and we know him, of course, as Jesus Christ. And this is an astounding story that has become, the center it brought about an absolute revolution in the understanding of man and God, and man in the image of God as a creative individual. And it is about an individual who stood up in his own way around a different concept of man to a corrupt oligarchy, tortured, imprisoned, and put to death under Pontius Pilate, as they say in the Nicene Creed. And of course, in Christian theology, Christ's exoneration happened very soon, 3 days later, with his resurrection from the dead. LaRouche, however, talking about this, and he talked about this a lot, dwells upon the image of Gethsemane. And when Christ, all alone, abandoned even by his closest cadre, takes the cup and walks toward his suffering and death as a necessary atonement for mankind and requirement for human survival at that moment in history. Now on January 25th, 1989, 2 days before his sentencing in Alexandria, Virginia, LaRouche received a clemency offer from London, from a man named Kenneth de Courcy. Mr. de Courcy was quite an individual. He was absolutely tight with the British elites on the highest levels. He ran something called the Intelligence Digest. He was actually in at the point that there was a crisis in the monarchy where Edward VIII was forced out because he was so supportive of Hitler that there was no way the empire, the United Kingdom, could have an alliance with Roosevelt against Hitler with Edward VIII at the helm. So Edward VIII was forced out. George V came in, but and we were nominal allies with the UK during the war. But George V didn't live very long. He died in 1952, and the daughter Elizabeth was a mere 23 years of age at the time. It's come out subsequently that Kenneth de Courcy was involved in a project to bring Edward VIII out of retirement, right, back to the throne, or at least to be the chief agent or babysitter for Queen Elizabeth to be running the show. That didn't happen, but gives you a sense of who this man was. And he sent a letter to LaRouche, who looked that he might well die, right? Saying that you have to make a deal, old man. You have to make a deal. If you don't make a deal, then you will die. Your organization will disappear, and you will be forgotten from history. We know that LaRouche did not make a deal. Here he is in handcuffs. And I will tell you, by the way, I was there that day. I was in Alexandria, Virginia that day. It was a bitter, bitter cold day. These were my friends on trial. Right behind you can see LaRouche, Mike Billington, who's still my friend, and others who were sentenced to, gruesome prison terms, right? But within an hour, LaRouche had drafted a statement, I'll quote here, called "I Become a Martyr." He says, "I have walked to my trial, conviction, and sentencing with the image of Christ in Gethsemane before my eyes, as have all Christian martyrs. I face the prospect of my murder under present circumstances with that same view. The essential martyrdom for those, the essential thing is that if I am to be martyred so, I must do nothing to spoil the benefit of my martyrdom for those who survive me. And a few months later, he expanded on this initial statement, actually about a year later, in a statement you all should read called Speaking from Gethsemane.
It's up front, Joe.
Yes, and we have some copies out front for people that are here today, but you can access it on larouchepub.com. Now, this image of Gethsemane, of the necessity of the individual, being, taking the cup, taking the individual responsibility for the future of mankind, even when nobody else will do so, has inspired, other leaders, of course, over the millennia. On the left, we see here Dante Alighieri, who was banished from his native Florence, for standing up to the corruption of the oligarchy there, including the corruption within the Catholic Church. He never returned, but his image of, he created the Italian language, and his great work, the Commedia, helped bring that nation together as a nation, albeit after his death. But he was exonerated in the eyes of future generations. On the right, we see the image of Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, who as a teenager, seeing her own beloved France overrun by British occupation that had lasted close to 100 years, stood up, taking her inspiration from Gethsemane, and she was condemned as a heretic and burned at the stake. But within a generation of her death, her heroism inspired France to come together to repel the British and finally come together, as the first real nation in Europe. And then on the bottom, of course, we see Martin Luther King, and that picture is from his famous mountaintop speech, where he had a harbinger of his own death. He knew that the FBI was coming down on him, but he says, I don't care. Mortality or immortality is longevity is something I would wish, but it ain't everything, because as LaRouche said at his own sentencing, you can't stain your soul for the sake of a few more years. And there are other people today who we can point to who also, whether they draw specifically on the image of Gethsemane or not, I don't know. But you look at Ed Snowden, who is still there, who put his life on the line to reveal the illegal and illicit and immoral and pervasive wiretapping. I mean, people are talking about Huawei today. Who are they kidding? Right? Verizon, Google, and all these guys take the cake. They're all in league with the CIA and the NSA. I mean, that's what Snowden exposed, right? It was highly embarrassing to President Obama that his role in all of this was being exposed. In the middle, we see Julian Assange, right, who is in prison himself right now. And this is very important to the relevant moment, because everything that we've suffered through around, Putin hacking the elections, the whole Robert Mueller prosecution was based on his, on Julian Assange's release of these emails. And then on the right, you have William Binney, who is one of our allies. He was actually at the LaRouche Memorial. He himself quit his job as technical director of the National Security Agency when he saw that the software that he had designed was being used not to capture terrorists, but to spy on American citizens. They really weren't interested in getting at the core of terrorism, because terrorism is an instrument to keep nations and peoples in lines and to justify military occupation. But he is the one individual who, along with Julian Assange, can, if put before Congress, absolutely and completely refute the very basic lie about Russian hacking. And I'm going to go back to the Assange thing very quickly because, you know, now we're in this awful thing called the presidential election, and candidates are, you know, piously, you know, huffing and puffing about how much better they are than Trump. You know, William Weld has entered the race as a Republican, the same guy that prosecuted LaRouche. But what about Bernie Sanders, right? Bernie Sanders knows darn well that that Putin never hacked the Democratic Party headquarters. When Julian Assange released those documents, he was giving Bernie Sanders an opening to challenge the corruption within the Democratic Party itself that was tilting everything for Hillary Clinton back then. But
Bernie failed to take on.
Bernie, you know, has let that lie stand for 2 years. He has jumped on the impeach Trump bandwagon. One could forgive aspects of his world outlook, but you can't forgive that. He has allowed this lie to stand. He has therefore disqualified himself as any potential leader of this nation. So we're going to, but going back to the LaRouche case, I would really recommend people go and watch this video of the memorial that we just had, and also the memorial, the video we're coming out with next week. Particularly listen to the words of Helga LaRouche, you know, because Helga testified that it wasn't just about the injustice that was done to Lyndon, as awful as it was. And I can tell you, Helga herself suffered greatly, but she went all around the world while LaRouche was in prison and brought his ideas to China, to Russia, to Hungary, to Poland, and so forth. And in this very tumultuous period, think about 1989. LaRouche goes to prison in January. Tiananmen Square happened in May. The Berlin Wall came down in you know, September, October, that period. November, right? And you know, Bush brought in the New World Order, right, with the invasion of Iraq, right? But it was LaRouche's ideas that filled the vacuum during that period. And if he had plea bargained, that would have been impossible, because he would have been a corrupted soul that no one would believe. And we honor Helga that's carried this fight forward. But going back to the Garden of Gethsemane, you know, and Christ before Pilate, right? There's this interesting dialogue that shows up in the book of John, right? Where Pilate's trying to figure this man out. Who is Jesus, right? And what are you here for? And Jesus says, well, I come to witness to the truth. And Pilate says, well, what's truth? What is truth? And that's a question, right? What is truth? Right? That's your opinion. You've got your opinion, I've got my opinion. We get that all the time, right? And it's kind of a tough question. What is truth? What's the standard for truth? And in this essay on the Garden of Gethsemane, this is what LaRouche says. A second point, which I often raise, I think is essential to understand the few simple observations I have to make here. It is that in human reason, in the power, for example, to effect a valid fundamental scientific discovery which overturns in a large degree previous scientific opinion, we see a fundamental distinction between man and all beasts. This power of creative reason, typified by the power to make a valid fundamental scientific discovery, and also the power to transmit and to receive such a discovery, is that which sets man apart from the beasts. The emotion associated with that kind of human activity, whether in physical science, in the development of creative works, or performance of creative works of classical culture, or simply in caring for a child to nurture that quality of potential for the discovery in the child, is true love. Creative activity is human activity, and therefore the emotion associated with that kind of activity is true love. And it's true beauty, and as Keats tells us, beauty is truth and truth beauty. That's all you need to know. But in terms of the manifestation of this creative spark, in terms of mastering the laws and improving upon the laws of the universe, that's done through scientific advance to improve and uplift populations. And LaRouche gave a name to this, the potential that it creates, called potential relative population density. And so during those 5 years in prison, and we did get Mr. LaRouche out of prison after 5 years through a huge mobilization. I can show you toward the end of this pamphlet, which everyone should order and read and circulate. There are their names of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of congressmen, mayors, legislators, and so forth, calling upon President Clinton to exonerate LaRouche. Well, LaRouche didn't do that, but he did at least grant LaRouche parole. But during those 5 years in prison, when we witnessed the Berlin Wall come down, the Tiananmen Square events in China, LaRouche's ideas transformed the world according to the concept that I just enunciated. And that has come to us and is blossoming in the wonderful, astounding developments around the Belt and Road Initiative. And how this has transformed and uplifted people's lives, that is truth. And that is a much more powerful and substantial truth, that's transforming the world through win-win cooperation that outweighs all the lies about Putin hacking the elections and collusion and Iran did it and so forth. This Belt and Road Initiative, which is our initiative, our movement's initiative, Helga and Lyndon LaRouche's initiative, this is what is overweighing all events in the world.
What's that picture?
Well, this is a picture on the lower is the celebration of the opening of the great Kenya Railroad from Nairobi to Mpasha. I'm not sure about the one on the right. It is one of the hydroelectric dams that China is building. But so we're going into this Group of 20 summit within a couple of weeks, where we want to create the situation where you have a general reorganization of the world financial system, what LaRouche had dubbed back in the 1980s a new Bretton Woods. So you can write off trillions of dollars of speculative debt, create institutions of credit, nation to nation, to restart the world development. All the problems you see in the world, right? The migrant thing here with Mexico and El Salvador and Guatemala and the like. These could be solved by the U.S. participating in this. To assert that creative spark and that dominion over nature, which is the basis for real truth as it applies to the development of this world. But here we are going into this event, and who do we hear from this week? The Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, which also spawned something called the Council on Foreign Relations early on as the key think tank by which the British oligarchy would continue to set policy here. And what did they say? Oh yes, well, we have to rethink and strengthen Bretton Woods, i.e. co-opting LaRouche's phraseology. However, what we need to consider is that because of climate change, we have to think about that addressing climate change must be the guiding principle as opposed to economic growth. In other words, under the name of Bretton Woods, we're going to justify radically reducing the world's population to reduce carbon dioxide, the end of nation states, the end of sovereignty. Well, let this be the last big lie of the British Empire, because their lies aren't passing so well anymore. But the biggest lie of all that we have to overturn, and you've heard it, LaRouche, the crackpot, the conspiracy theorist, the proto-communist, the rip-off artist, the thief, all of this, the lies that went into the prosecution, where you had the U.S. media in league with the CIA and the FBI and the intelligence services. They make the attacks on Trump look like kid stuff. And so the LaRouche case has to be overturned. You can do it, President Trump. Our movement is working tirelessly to ensure that your presidency can succeed in working out a plan for a durable peace in concert with Russia, India, and China, including establishing the economic platform for the success of Project Artemis, a plan to return a human presence which will absolutely include at least one woman and maybe more, a female astronaut, to the moon within 5 years. We can do this, President Trump. You can provide the leadership, but you must take the first step. You can take this step today, President Trump, with a simple tweet. Exonerate Lyndon LaRouche. Thank you. And I'll take questions. Thank you very much.
I just want to add something, which is we have a specific idea.
Come on up, Evelyn.
I can just, people can hear from here.
This is Evelyn. Yay.
We have a specific idea to make the videotape on the exoneration of LaRouche go viral. We're going to release it in a different way, and every single person here should be involved in this. We're not just going to sort of dribble it out the way we usually do. But the videotape is complete, but will not be publicly released until 9 a.m. Eastern, which is 8 a.m. Central, next Friday, the 21st. And what we want to have everyone do is be prepared for your Facebook page, your Twitter account, your email, every possible way that you can get this out to social media, to just blast it out there all over the country through hundreds and thousands of people who are putting it out at the same time. That is the best way to actually have it picked up and go viral. So next Friday, June 21st, 8 a.m., it's going to be released, and everybody should be prepared to have it go out on, to be part of getting it out all over the place.
Yes, on that, so you can just go to LaRouchePAC.com/exonerate, and it'll just pop right up, and it is called what's it? The LaRouche case.
Robert Mueller's first hit job.
The LaRouche case, Robert Mueller's first hit job. But once again, Robert Mueller is, as we said in our thing, a hired political assassin for the British Empire. That's what we're going to sever, is this hideous relationship with the empire, and liberate President Trump and our nation to do what we got to do at this awesome moment in history. But yes, that's your marching orders, everyone out there, including send us a lot of money to help keep the fight moving forward. Are there any other questions? Or comments?
Just on what on Mueller's on the president's space program and what you just said about it, I would say to the moon, Alice.
Those of us boomers that remember Jackie Gleason and the Honeymooners, to the moon, Alice. Well, now we can make it happen, and that's our answer to the Me Too movement. We want the ladies to be up there, right? Okay, well that's it, guys. Thank you very much, and we're here in Houston. We'd love you to be part of our ongoing activities. There may be a LaRouche office near you out there, so check in. We have conference calls every Thursday night, and in fact, Mrs. LaRouche will be on a conference call this Monday. So no one should sit home feeling frustrated and helpless. There's plenty of things we can do to save the situation, and that's what life's all about. Keeps you happy. Thank you very much.